All right, so after a few weeks of doing this, we've hit some of the really famous ones that I think people even that are not believers and maybe do not read the Bible are familiar with, that have entered into pop culture. This one you don't hear a ton of except inside the church, and it's from Luke chapter 14, verses 15 through 24. It's the parable of the Great Banquet, and it's one of my personal ones that I like, but it's because I think I find it really challenging to live up to. So give us a little context for what this one's all about.
Yeah, so I will say the parable of the banquet is probably my favorite parable in terms of its context, because it would make like a really good episode of like The Office, because it's so uncomfortable, right? Like the whole situation, it's so uncomfortable what happens to get this story going. So Jesus is at a banquet when he tells this story. So that's like strike one, right? Like he's telling a story about a party while he's at a party. So he starts telling this, he comes in, he sees all these people at the banquet, and what he notices is that they're all jockeying for the best seat at the table, right? And that day, in an honor-shame culture, it really matters where you sit so that people can see that you're important. So Jesus notices this, and he just starts commenting to everybody like, hey, don't do that. Like when you go to a banquet, don't take the seat of honor, because like someone more important may come, take that seat, then you're embarrassed. But if you get elevated later to a better spot, then that's good for you. Like, don't be that way.
I am reminded, though, of one time when Kobe Bryant entered the bench and he made a rookie go sit on the ground. And he was in street clothes, but it's a little bit like the middle school on the bench, I guess.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, so, and after that, so he's made everybody a little bit uncomfortable. Then after that, he looks at the host of the banquet. He says, hey, when you host a banquet, like you're doing right now, when you host a banquet, like don't invite your friends and your family. Don't invite them because they can repay you. Like you're going to expect that they're going to invite you to their banquet. Instead, invite the poor, the lame, invite people who can't repay you and have a banquet that way. So it's incredibly uncomfortable. He's insulted his host a little bit. He's insulted the crowd. And then there's this guy. I can't imagine. I try to imagine this guy. He's trying to ease the tension in the room, right? And so like in the back of the room, you hear this voice is like, hey, what a blessing it'll be to attend a banquet in the kingdom of God. He's like trying to, Jesus juke Jesus, right? Like how great it is going to be to have a feast in heaven. And Jesus starts his parable basically by being like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the feast in the kingdom of heaven and that banquet. And let's talk about who's actually going to be there.
It's sort of like that moment as a parent when your kid comes in and goes, here's a question you've not thought of. And and you're like, I'm not fooled. So it's very awkward.
Yes.
There's a lot of tension. The spotlight's on, and then he has this teaching.
And he has this story. Yeah. So he goes into the story of this feast, this master's throwing a great banquet for a ton of guests. And at the time of the banquet, he has his servant go out and tell these guests, okay, the banquet's ready. You can come. And these guys just make excuses, those who are invited. The first one says, I bought a field and I have to go plow it.
I love it.
That's reasonable,
yeah, let's
right?
go look at the
like
field.
You have to work. The second one is I bought 5 oxen and I have to try them out. Okay, like kind of reasonable. The last one's my favorite. They just straight up say, I just got married and I can't come.
Yeah.
Like that just cracks me up for some reason. And of course, like the master is furious at this and very offended. Yeah. He's like, I have created this banquet for you and you're just making excuses as to why you can't come. So then he tells his servant, hey, go out into the streets to find the poor and the lame and the beggars and invite them into this banquet. And it's interesting because at the very end, the servant comes back and says, like, we still have more room. And it's a really, like, fascinating tidbit because he's saying, like, those people still think they're not worthy enough to attend. So you've got these two things happening at this banquet. The banquet, of course, is a stand-in for the kingdom of God, which I love because God knows how to throw a party. But God so graciously gives us this invitation to the banquet. And there's two things that are happening because the first ones think that they don't need the Lord. They don't need the kingdom of God because they've got everything going on. Like they have land, they have jobs, they have relationships. And so they're making excuses of like, oh, I don't need that because I've got everything I need right here. And then when he invites the others in, some of them don't attend because they don't feel worthy enough to attend. So, there's two different responses here to this invitation. And sometimes we reject it because we think we already have everything. And sometimes we reject it because we feel like we're not worthy enough to attend.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those you read. It's funny. Like the answers to come attend my party is like comically bad answers. So as we think application, what's this mean for us?
Yeah, that's really good. I think kind of a little bit about the, story Jesus was telling before and, here in this parable. I think the first thing is just the importance of humility that we need to have in our life. And I think that comes from a place of understanding who we are, right? And I think, like, I do think, like, there's a place of, like, where we do need to recognize, like, hey, we are those poor, lowly people, which is funny because the people that he's talking to are also the poor, you know, lonely, broken people. And I think oftentimes I think about the believers in my life that I feel like, at least with the relationship that I have with them and the context in which I have a relationship with them, the people that I think understand, like, grace the most are the people that understand, like, hey, like, yeah, like, there's nothing in me that deserves any of this in my life. And it's not that I have to use that to feel awful about myself every single day, but it actually gives me an identity to be able to work from, because then everything else in context means that, like, hey, like, I don't need the highest seat. I don't need it. You know, I'll go sit in the seat. You know, and if God decides to invite me into this, then fantastic. Right. But also, I'm convicted personally about all the different excuses that these people made at this banquet. And I see, just like with the soil, you know, parable and sowing seeds and, you know, the different things that grow up. I see that in me, too, of like, hey, there's different seasons of my life where I let this or that distract me from being invited and being a part of something that God is doing. And so I think that there's a lot that's in this one.
I like the ending, and I want us to talk about that for a second, where it ends with this idea of there's still more room. It's a fascinating ending. Why do you think it ends with the idea of, like, it's not full yet, there's still more room, and what's that challenge within us?
You know, I think Jesus is confronting the self-satisfaction of the religious leaders again, and basically telling them, like, hey, if you're not there, if you don't enter into this banquet, it's not for lack of invitation. It's not for lack of room. It's because you didn't realize how much you needed it, right? That you passed up the invitation. You walked away from it. And it's kind of an interesting kind of cousin to the parable of the prodigal son with the older son a little bit, is like, if you are outside this feast, it's because you didn't want to go in. It's not because you weren't invited. It's because you stubbornly refused.
Yeah, it's the room of God is never full.
Yes.
There's always still more room. Yes, for you, and yes, for you, and yes, with where you've come from and your history and your story. But yes, it's also true for your neighbor as well, as there's still more room. How do you interact with that?
Yeah, I think that kind of what Derek was going back to as well, like these parables kind of overlap in sense, like, it's always about the motive of your heart, right? Like, it's what's distracting me from entering in. And it could be pride of thinking, oh, I'm not worthy enough to attend. Well, that's an issue of pride too, because then you're not accepting the grace that the Lord's given you to attend, you know? And I see myself in both of these situations. And I love, Brandon, what you were talking about of, like, well, it's your own fault if you don't attend, you know, because the Lord's given you an invitation. There's plenty of room. But it's also like a sense of there's room of, like, go and harvest the field, right? It's also an invitation to, like, be on mission and invite other people into the banquet, because there's still more time. Like, there's still time, there's still room. Invite more people in.
We are never going to fill the table of God.
Yeah.
Right? You're never going to invite someone to come into the banquet and find out there's not a spot for them.
Yeah.
The table is always open.
Everyone knows that fear. If you've ever thrown any sort of party or get together, there's the little bit of fear of
Running out of ice.
I don't worry about that. But the fear, though, is, like, who's going to come?
Yeah.
Right? Like, who's going to come? Are they coming? Right? Like, you're thinking about that, you know, and, you know, it's kind of interesting to think of God in that light of, like, I wonder who's going to respond. Derek, I was thinking through this other part. My takeaway when I wrote this down, as I just kind of tried to cleanly relook at this with a fresh perspective, the first thing I wrote down, your excuses don't matter, right? Like, your excuses, whatever it is, don't matter. As a dad, we get that, right? It's hilarious. Your kids are younger than mine, but they're younger. Their excuses are funny, you know, like really funny on why they did what they did. You know, you see straight through it and they think they've done that. But as you think about excuses in people not attending the banquet of God, how do you interact and how do you keep your heart and mind pure with that?
Yeah, I think, like, when it comes to me, I think it's trying to recenter myself to this understanding of, like, hey, like, well, this is what I would say, honestly. I'm very quickly distracted in my life and in many different ways, very quickly distracted. And it is so much easier for me to give an excuse for myself than it is to extend grace to another person, especially as it pertains to, like, well, why wouldn't you be a part of this? Or why wouldn't you go do this? Well, it's a lot easier for me to say, oh, well, you know, I had this going on, I had that going on. And And I think for me, this one probably highlights a lot of the brokenness in me of I'm very distracted. And when, there are available moments in my life that are absolutely there, I have to choose that I'm going to spend those moments with the Lord, communing with him. And if I don't, that's on me.
Yeah. Yeah, you're responsible for your choices and your actions. And so I think this is just another one of those powerful reminders that like God's not going to be impressed with your excuse, right? Because he knows the explanation. He's there. He knows exactly who you are and exactly what motivates you.
Thank you for joining us today as part of our Parables Bible study. We really hope that talking through Jesus' key teachings from the Bible really benefited you. More than anything else, we would love to be able to help you take some next steps and be engaged with all that's happening with Southeast Christian Church and our online ministry. You can always text the words SC Online to 733-733 for all the ways to take that next step. Send us an email or definitely visit our website. But we're glad that you're a part of this. Join in and be a part of what's happening.